once again in the garage on Saturday morning. This is March 1st, beware the Ides of March. And in preparation for a few little projects to do, I had emailed the XJ list about the items I'd like to get accomplished. And specifically I said that I've got the carburetors in place and I'd like to get the cam covers on. And was there anything I needed besides the gasket, like some kind of liquid? I also said that I had heard to use brass washers under the copper washers, which are standard. And let's see, oh, the plugs. This car is going to need some body work, and therefore I'm probably not going to drive it on the highway in the near future. And the thought was, since I do need to tune up the engine, and I'm going to buy spark plugs, should I buy a somewhat hotter plug than normal in order to keep the carbon fouling down? And I got several responses. The first one is from Craig, and Craig writes, I use Permatex high tack to hold the gaskets in place, especially for the narrow like cam cover gaskets which can move around on you. He said, I've never used brass washers under the copper, and I can't see any reason to do that. He said, I would put a little dab of silicone under the washers to seal it. Then he warns, don't over torque the nuts on the cam covers. He once broke his stud, and he thinks the spec is 7 foot-pounds of torque. And his suggestion was, if I put my little finger in the ring end of the wrench and tightened, then the torque was about right. And for plugs, he said, I'd suggest use of an NGK BPR 5ES. He said he's used them in his carbureted Daimler, and they work well. The 5 is a fairly hot plug. 6 is colder if you need that, but 5 is the standard recommendation for the XK V12. That's from Craig. Thanks, Craig. Appreciate that. And now there's a response from Pete. And Pete says, depends what kind of gaskets you have. The continuous Gore-Tex ones don't need anything, but I suppose on a 71 you have the earlier cut gaskets, and that's correct. The 71 is not a continuous gasket. It's like a long U-shaped, and therefore it's easy to move out of place. He said I'd use some sort of gasket dressing, cement to hold them in place, and seal around the rear cutout. Don't use anything under the copper washers, and be sure the copper ones are soft and annealed, and I did anneal these washers. A dab of gasket goo there if you're worried. I wouldn't use anything over the copper either, since the whole purpose for it is to deform. The copper is to deform and seal the variable gaps, so putting a load, spreading harder washer over them, leaves you with another surface to seal. He says you might be right about the hot plug, but you'll never know unless you try the stock plugs first, and you'd be wasting your money to buy 2 sets of plugs. So he said he suggests using the standard plugs first, and only change if I do have a fouling problem. So those are good suggestions, Pete. Thank you. Then we have a suggestion from Bob in St. Louis, Missouri, and he said, why not take Pete's advice and follow your own leaning at the same time? Use plugs that are standard for the Series 3. These are 1 heat range hotter or higher than was originally spec'd for the Series 1, which is what my car is. The Champion N12Y versus the 11s. So I never understood why Jaguar used hotter plugs in a hotter running engine. So I guess the Series 3 engines run hotter than the Series 1. He bought some for his 12, and they seem to be working fine. So Bob, thank you very much for those suggestions. Here's one from Alex in California, and he's saying that just note that the quote heat range unquote has to do with the plug, not the engine coolant temp. The latter has to do with mechanical constraints / tolerances and a little bit of efficiency. Plug tips, however, sit in the burning mixture at about 10 times coolant temp. The more recessed the plug is, the cooler it is during combustion. It also then has somewhat more chance of fouling, so quote hotter unquote plugs provide not only improved position in the mixture to be ignited, they tend to be cleaner because of the higher temps they see. However, they also must be designed to stay cool enough to avoid pre-ignition. So he's suggesting that the Champion RN12YC, open parenthesis, stock number 404, close parenthesis, has help cooling its tip enough via its choice of materials, and the C for copper. I'm sorry, the C for the copper conductor inside its body. The R, by the way, is for included resistor, and included resistor to reduce radio interference. So that's Alex from California. Thank you, Alex, for that suggestion. And another one, second email from Alex regarding the gasket, and he said that the gaskets can be stuck to the cam covers using something like copper coat, which allows movement during the alignment and makes the job easier. The other face of the gasket just needs a swipe of oil to be sure it can squeeze into any imperfections in the head. God forbid my head should have imperfections, but be that as it may. The nuts should have copper washers against the cam covers, and use a stainless washer over the copper to give a more uniform pressure, which avoids cracking the cover and seals better. Oil all the parts and use a short wrench. I've not had any leaks with the above. So thank you, Alex, for that. And last but not least, Mark, writing from California also, Santa Clara. I too use Permatex semi-permanent stuff, black, open parenthesis black, and it works well for sealing and holding the gaskets in place. I've also had great success with the stuff for thermostat gaskets, so there's another use for the stuff. I annealed the copper washers, but they leaked. In the end, I put Permatex under those too, although I think silicone caulk would work well. And he reminded me that I had the process backwards. You put the washer on top of the copper, whether it be stainless steel or brass, you put that washer on top of the copper. The copper goes against the cam cover. Okay, we're going to start this morning with the installation of the cam covers. And I have the gaskets ready, and I'm using some Permatex copper spray a gasket, which I'm going to use to tack the gaskets onto the cam covers, and I'm going to cover the the head surface that the gasket goes on with some motor oil, so as to allow the gasket to seal better. I've also have brass, number 14 brass washers to cover the copper washers. And I also have GE silicone spray, GE silicone caulk, black, and this is the same, it's called Blacktop and Roof, and this is the same silicone that I used on the head studs when I was inserting them into the block and making that seal. So still good. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean the mating surface on the cam covers, and you can't see it, but on these cam covers there's some overspray when I painted them, and some oil and some grease and so on. So I've taken some rough 0 or probably 2.0 steel wool and just lightly gone over the surface to get any of that paint and so on off the sealing surface. Also on the back of the cover here there's this rounded area that's going to mate to the metal on the head itself, and therefore I'm particularly concerned about anything there because there is no gasket as such between that and the metal. So I'm going to make sure that every bit of oil and grease, and there's a little bit of paint in there too, is off that, so we get as good a seal as possible. And I'm going to tap out the cover in case any of the steel wool has gotten in there. Looks good, clean. And at the same time, I'm going to do the same thing with the head mating surface, so that that too is clean and free of as much imperfections as I can get it. So I'm going to take the steel wool and just, and this is of course pretty clean already because this was from the shop, but a couple of basically stains more than really paint or anything on here. But again, that rear area where there is no gasket, make sure that's thoroughly clean. And I'm trying not to get any of the steel wool fibers into the head.